For months, Emily Carter told herself it was nothing. Just stress from long days at work. Just fatigue that comes with getting older. Just one of those quiet changes people learn to live with. Every morning in her quiet Ohio suburb began the same way. Sunlight slipping gently through the blinds, casting long shadows across a home that looked, from the outside, perfectly normal. The coffee machine would hum softly in the background, filling the kitchen with a familiar scent. Yet her cup would often sit untouched, growing colder by the minute. Her phone would buzz from another room, sometimes once, sometimes repeatedly. But Emily had begun to ignore it, convincing herself she would get to it later. There was always a reason to wait, always something else to focus on. Always a quiet reassurance that nothing was truly wrong. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A small change here, a strange feeling there, moments that didn't quite add up, but didn't seem serious enough to question. She would pause, think about it briefly, then move on with her day. Friends noticed she seemed distracted at times, her daughter once asking if she was feeling all right, but Emily would smile, brush it off, and change the subject. Life continued, routines remained intact, and the house stayed just as calm and predictable as it had always been. But the truth was, something had already begun to shift, slowly and quietly, in a way that didn't demand attention right away. It didn't shout or force itself into the open. It waited. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. And that one small sign never fully went away. Instead, it lingered in the background of her life, becoming just familiar enough to ignore. Emily adjusted without realizing it, changing small habits, avoiding certain moments, telling herself that whatever she was experiencing would pass on its own. It's what most people do when faced with something they don't fully understand. They minimize it. They explain it away. They choose comfort over concern. And for a while, that choice seems harmless. But by the time Emily began to truly question what was happening, by the time the pieces started to feel connected instead of random, everything around her had already begun to change in ways she couldn't control. The silence in the house no longer felt peaceful. The missed calls no longer felt unimportant. And that closed bedroom door, the one she walked past every single day without thinking twice, would soon become the center of a story no one saw coming. What started as something small, something easy to ignore, would eventually lead to a discovery that left even seasoned investigators struggling to understand how it had gone unnoticed for so long. Because sometimes the most life-altering moments don't arrive with noise or warning. Sometimes they begin quietly, hidden inside the routines we trust the most. And in Emily's case, by the time she realized what that one sign truly meant, there was no turning back. No simple explanation left to hold on to, only a series of questions that would change everything. And what they found inside that home, after months of silence and overlooked warnings, would shock even those who believed they had seen it all. This is the story of Emily Carter, a woman who overlooked a single warning sign, one that seemed so small, so easy to dismiss, that it barely registered as a concern in the beginning. It is the story of a family that never saw it coming. A family that believed they understood the rhythm of their own lives, the patterns, the habits, the quiet assurances that everything was exactly as it should be. For years, Emily had been the center of that stability, the one who kept things moving, who remembered the details others forgot, who carried on without complaint, even when life demanded more than usual. Nothing about her suggested that anything was wrong, and yet, piece by piece, something was beginning to shift beneath the surface. What makes this story difficult to understand is not just what happened, but how long it went unnoticed. Because the truth is, the sign was there. It didn't appear suddenly or without warning. It showed up quietly, repeating itself in ways that could have been recognized. If only someone had stopped long enough to question it, but Emily didn't, and neither did the people around her. They saw what they expected to see. They heard what they wanted to hear, and they trusted that whatever felt slightly off would eventually correct itself, just as it always had before. It's a pattern many people fall into, especially when life feels familiar and controlled. So the questions begin to form. The same questions investigators would later ask as they tried to piece together what really happened inside that quiet Ohio home. What exactly was the sign that Emily kept ignoring? And why did it never feel urgent enough to act on? Why did someone as attentive and thoughtful as her continue to push it aside? Even as it became more consistent, more difficult to explain, and perhaps most unsettling of all, how did something so seemingly harmless lead to an outcome that no one in her family could have imagined? Something that would force them to rethink everything they believed about the months leading up to that moment. There were fragments of answers scattered throughout her daily life, hidden in routines that never changed, in conversations that seemed ordinary at the time, in small details that only gained meaning in hindsight. A missed call here, a forgotten task there, a moment of confusion that passed too quickly to hold on to. Each one, on its own, appeared insignificant, but together they told a story that no one had taken the time to fully read. And that is what makes this case so compelling. Not just the outcome, but the path that led there. Because to understand what truly happened to Emily Carter, to understand how everything unraveled the way it did, we have to go back to the very beginning. Before the questions, before the concern, before anyone realized that the life they were living was already beginning to change in ways they could not yet see. Emily Carter was the kind of woman most people would describe as steady, dependable, and quietly strong. In her early 50s, she had built a life that, on the surface, reflected years of consistency and care. She lived in a modest home in Ohio with her husband, David Carter, a man who had spent decades working long hours to provide for their family. Together they had raised 2 children, both now adults, each carving out their own paths, but still deeply connected to the home they grew up in. Their daughter, Lauren Carter, called often, sometimes just to check in, sometimes to ask for advice. Their son, Michael Carter, visited when he could, bringing with him the familiar energy that once filled the house daily. It was a life many would recognize, built on routine, small traditions, and an unspoken understanding that things would continue much the same way they always had. Emily's days followed a rhythm that rarely changed. Mornings began early, often before the rest of the house stirred, giving her a quiet moment to herself before the responsibilities of the day took over. She handled most of the household details, from groceries to appointments, keeping everything running without drawing attention to the effort it required. In the evenings, she and David would sit together, sometimes watching television, sometimes just sharing the same space in comfortable silence. There was nothing dramatic about their life, nothing that stood out as unusual, and that was exactly how Emily preferred it. Stability for her was something to protect. Like many people her age, Emily carried small concerns she rarely voiced. Occasional fatigue, minor aches, moments where she felt slightly off but couldn't quite explain why. These were things she brushed aside without much thought. When her close friend Karen Mitchell noticed she seemed more tired than usual during one of their weekly conversations, Emily laughed it off, saying she had just been busy and needed a bit more rest. When Lauren asked during a phone call if everything was all right, sensing something in her mother's tone, Emily reassured her quickly, shifting the conversation to something lighter. It was a pattern that repeated itself. Small observations met with simple explanations, each one closing the door on any deeper concern. There were moments, subtle and easy to overlook, where something didn't quite align with the Emily everyone knew. A forgotten detail here, a pause in conversation that lasted a second too long, a task left unfinished without explanation. None of it felt serious enough to question. Even when David noticed her standing still in the kitchen one evening, as if trying to recall what she had come in for, she simply smiled and shook her head, saying it was nothing. Just one of those moments everyone has, and that was the word she returned to again and again. Nothing. It became her way of keeping everything in place, of avoiding the possibility that something might actually be wrong. Over time, these moments became part of the background of her life, blending into the routine so seamlessly that they stopped standing out. altogether. The people around her adjusted without realizing it, accepting small changes as normal, trusting that Emily, as she always had, would take care of herself if there was truly something to worry about. It's a quiet kind of assumption, one that often goes unspoken, built on years of reliability and trust. But the truth was, those small moments weren't random. They weren't isolated or harmless. They were connected in ways no one had yet considered, forming a pattern that was slowly becoming harder to ignore, even if no one was ready to confront it. And by the time those patterns began to reveal themselves more clearly, by the time the idea that something might actually be wrong started to take shape, the situation had already moved far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Because what Emily kept dismissing, what everyone around her accepted as nothing, was already leading somewhere. And when it finally came into focus, when the reality of it could no longer be softened or explained away, it would force everyone who knew her to reconsider those quiet moments they had overlooked. But it wasn't nothing, not even close. At first it came and went, easy to ignore, easy to explain away as just another part of getting older or being overwhelmed. Emily Carter began noticing that the moments she once brushed aside were returning more often, lingering just a little longer each time. What used to feel like a passing inconvenience started to feel unfamiliar, like something she couldn't fully control. She would walk into a room and forget why she was there, stand still for a few seconds longer than usual, then quietly recover and move on as if nothing had happened. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't alarming. And that's exactly why it never felt urgent enough to address. But as the days went on, the changes became harder to dismiss. Emily found herself misplacing things more frequently, sometimes in places that didn't make sense. Her phone, once always within reach, would be left in another room, buzzing unanswered for longer than before. She began repeating small details in conversations without realizing it, telling the same story twice in the same sitting, only noticing when someone gently pointed it out. Each time she laughed it off, offering the same familiar explanation, that she was just tired, that she had a lot on her mind, that it wasn't anything serious. And for a while those explanations were enough, not just for her, but for everyone around her. At night, when the house grew quiet and the distractions of the day faded away, there were moments Emily couldn't ignore as easily. She would wake up unsure of the time, unsure of how long she had been asleep, sometimes unsure of where she was, for just a brief, unsettling second. The silence in the house, once comforting, began to feel different, heavier in a way she couldn't quite define. She started leaving lights on more often, lingering in rooms longer than necessary, before moving on. But even then, she kept these moments to herself, choosing not to share them, choosing instead to hold on to the belief that they would pass. David Carter began to notice subtle changes too, though he struggled to put them into words. It wasn't one single thing he could point to, but a collection of small differences that didn't quite fit together. Emily seemed more distant at times, more distracted, her attention drifting in conversations in a way that hadn't happened before. One evening, he watched as she stood at the kitchen counter, her hands resting still, her expression distant, as if she were trying to piece together something just out of reach. When he asked if she was all right, she turned to him quickly, smiled, and said the same thing she always did, that it was nothing, just a long day. But the truth was becoming harder to contain. The sign she had been ignoring was no longer subtle, no longer something that came and went, without leaving a trace. It was present now, consistent, shaping her days in ways she could no longer fully control. Still, Emily held on to her explanations, adjusting her routine to compensate, avoiding situations where the changes might become more obvious. It's a quiet form of coping, one that many people adopt without realizing it, a way of maintaining normalcy even when something feels off. Then came the moment that changed everything. Not gradually, not quietly, but all at once. It happened on an evening that began like any other, with nothing to suggest that it would end differently. The house was calm, the routine familiar, the kind of night no one would think twice about. Emily moved through the house as she always did, completing small tasks, settling into the rhythm she had followed for years. There was no warning, no clear indication that anything was about to shift. And then something unusual happened. David would later recall hearing a sudden noise from another room, something out of place in the stillness of the house. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to break the quiet, enough to draw his attention. When he called out to Emily, there was no response. At first, he assumed she hadn't heard him, that she was simply occupied with something else. But as the silence stretched on longer than it should have, a sense of unease began to settle in. When he finally moved toward the sound, what he found would stay with him in a way he could never fully explain. It was the kind of moment that doesn't register all at once, where the mind struggles to process what it's seeing, trying to make sense of something that doesn't fit into the expected order of things. Emily was there, but not as she had been just moments before. Something was clearly wrong, something that couldn't be explained away with the simple reassurances she had relied on for months. Time seemed to slow in that instant, each second stretching out as reality began to take shape. The normalcy of the evening disappeared, replaced by a sudden clarity that something had been building toward this moment all along. Every small sign, every overlooked detail, every quiet dismissal now pointed to something much larger, something that could no longer be ignored. And that was the last normal moment anyone would remember. What followed raised more questions than answers. And for the first time, the quiet life Emily Carter had built with David Carter was replaced by confusion, urgency, and a growing sense that something far more complex was unfolding. The emergency response was immediate, the kind that shifts a home from a place of comfort into a scene of concern within minutes. Paramedics moved quickly, speaking in calm but focused tones, assessing Emily as David stood nearby, trying to piece together what had just happened. He repeated the same details again and again, how the evening had been normal, how there had been no clear warning, how she had said it was nothing every time he asked. But even as he spoke, there was a realization beginning to form that those moments he had overlooked might have meant more than either of them had understood. At the hospital, the uncertainty deepened. Initial assessments didn't provide clear answers, only possibilities that seemed to shift with each new observation. Doctors asked questions about Emily's recent behavior, her health, her routines, details that suddenly carried more weight than they ever had before. David did his best to recall everything, mentioning the forgetfulness, the late-night confusion, the small changes that had seemed harmless at the time. It was only now, in this setting, that those details began to feel connected, as if they were part of a pattern no one had taken the time to fully recognize. Lauren Carter arrived soon after, her concern turning quickly into a need for clarity. She asked the same questions the doctors did, searching for something concrete, something that could explain how things had escalated so quickly. Michael Carter followed, bringing with him a similar urgency, both of them trying to reconcile the mother they knew with the situation, now unfolding in front of them. Each of them had noticed small things in recent months, moments that felt slightly off, but never serious enough to confront directly. Now, those moments returned with a different meaning, forming a timeline that none of them had intended to create. As the hours passed, the situation began to attract attention beyond the immediate family. Medical specialists were consulted, each bringing a different perspective, each considering a different possibility. Some focused on physical causes, conditions that might explain the gradual changes Emily had experienced. Others considered psychological factors, exploring whether stress or something less visible could have played a role. There were no immediate conclusions, only theories, each one raising new questions rather than providing closure. In the days that followed, the effort to understand what had happened became more structured, more deliberate. Emily's recent history was examined in detail, her routines reconstructed through conversations with those who knew her best. Karen Mitchell spoke about their recent interactions, recalling moments where Emily seemed distracted, or unusually quiet. David described the changes he had witnessed at home, the pauses, the forgotten tasks, the increasing sense that something wasn't quite right. Lauren and Michael added their own observations, each detail contributing to a larger picture that was only now beginning to take shape. But as that picture developed, it didn't become clearer. It became more complicated. Some details pointed in one direction, suggesting a gradual medical issue that had gone unnoticed. Others hinted at something less straightforward, inconsistencies that didn't fully align with a single explanation. There were moments in the timeline that didn't connect cleanly, gaps that raised new concerns about what might have been missed or misunderstood. It was this lack of clarity that made the situation feel less like a simple case of cause and effect, and more like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together. Speculation began to grow, not just within the family, but among those trying to help them find answers. Was this something that had been developing physically over time? A condition that had quietly progressed without obvious warning? Or was there a psychological element, something that had influenced Emily's behavior in ways that were harder to detect? And then there was the question no one wanted to ask directly, whether there was something else involved, something that hadn't yet been identified, something that might change the understanding of everything that had happened. It was in the middle of this uncertainty, as the investigation into Emily's condition continued, that a new piece of information emerged, something that hadn't been considered before. It wasn't immediately obvious how significant it was, but it stood out enough to draw attention, enough to shift the focus of those trying to make sense of the situation. Records were reviewed again, conversations revisited, small details re-examined with a new perspective. Then investigators found something that changed the direction of the entire case. What had once been seen as a series of unrelated symptoms, small and easily dismissed, now began to take on a different meaning. The sign Emily had ignored for months was no longer just a minor concern or a simple oversight. It was part of something deeper, something that had been present all along but had only now come into focus. And as that realization settled in, it became clear that the story of what happened to Emily Carter was far from what anyone had initially believed, pointing toward an explanation that would challenge everything they thought they understood about those quiet, overlooked months. The sign Emily Carter ignored wasn't random. It wasn't harmless. It was a warning, one that had been repeating itself quietly for months, one that had woven itself into her daily life so subtly that it became part of her normal. As investigators and medical specialists continued to review her case, the pieces that once seemed scattered began to align in a way that could no longer be overlooked. What they uncovered was not sudden, not unexpected in a clinical sense, but devastating in its clarity. Emily had been showing early signs of a serious neurological condition, one that affects memory, awareness, and the ability to process reality in consistent ways. It was the kind of condition that often begins with small lapses, moments that feel insignificant on their own, but over time form a pattern that becomes impossible to ignore. In Emily's case, that pattern had been there, visible in hindsight through every forgotten task, every repeated conversation, every moment of quiet confusion she had brushed aside. The missed calls, the untouched coffee, the pauses in familiar routines. They were not isolated incidents. They were signals, early indicators that something deeper was changing within her. But because they arrived gradually, because they didn't disrupt her life all at once, they never demanded immediate attention. And like many people in similar situations, Emily chose the explanation that felt safest, that it was stress, that it was fatigue, that it would pass. For David Carter, the realization came with a weight that was difficult to process. As doctors explained what they believed had been developing over those months, he began to replay the moments he had witnessed, the times he had asked if she was all right and accepted her answer without question. Each memory carried a new meaning now, each small detail taking on a significance it hadn't held before. Lauren Carter felt it too, recalling their conversations, the subtle changes in her mother's voice, The times she had sensed something was off, but chose not to press further. Michael Carter found himself doing the same, revisiting visits that once felt ordinary, now filled with details he wished he had noticed more clearly. What made the situation even more difficult to accept was not just the diagnosis itself, but the understanding that it had been there long before anyone acknowledged it. The condition had been progressing quietly, shaping Emily's behavior in ways that were easy to misinterpret, easy to dismiss. It influenced her decisions, her awareness, even her ability to recognize that something was wrong. In many ways, the very nature of what she was experiencing made it harder for her to see it for what it was. As more information came to light, the timeline that had once felt confusing began to settle into place. The early signs, the gradual changes, the moment everything came to a halt. They were all connected, all part of a process that had been unfolding long before that night. There was no single moment where everything changed, no clear line where things went from normal to concerning. Instead, it was a slow shift, one that only became visible when viewed in its entirety. The emotional weight of that realization settled heavily on those closest to her. It wasn't just about what had happened, but about what might have been different if the signs had been recognized earlier, if one conversation had gone deeper, if one moment had been taken more seriously, if one decision had been made differently. These were questions without clear answers, but they lingered all the same, shaping the way each of them understood the past. Because in the end, the most difficult truth wasn't just the condition itself. It was how easily it had blended into everyday life, how naturally it had been explained away. And as that truth became impossible to ignore, it left behind a question that would stay with them long after the explanations were complete. If she had acted sooner, everything might have been different. In the end, the question wasn't just what happened to Emily Carter. It was why no one saw it for what it truly was, even when the signs were right there, repeating themselves in quiet, ordinary ways that blended into everyday life. Because as the full picture came together, something became clear that no one in the Carter family could easily accept. Emily hadn't been the only one who noticed the changes. Others had seen glimpses of it too. Small moments that felt slightly off, brief flashes of concern that never fully turned into action. David Carter remembered nights when he hesitated before asking if she was okay. Moments where something didn't feel right, but didn't seem serious enough to push further. Lauren Carter recalled conversations where her mother sounded distant, just enough to notice, but not enough to alarm. Even Karen Mitchell had sensed a shift, something subtle in Emily's energy that she couldn't quite define at the time. Each of them had a moment, a brief window where instinct suggested something might be wrong. But like Emily, they chose the explanation that felt easier to accept. They trusted the normalcy of their lives, the routine they had known for years, the belief that serious problems announce themselves clearly, not quietly through small changes that can be explained away. It's a natural response, one that most people don't question until they are forced to look back and reconsider what they missed. What makes Emily's story stay with people isn't just the diagnosis or the outcome, but how familiar the pattern feels. The idea that something important can exist in plain sight, repeated often enough to be noticed, yet still dismissed because it doesn't disrupt life in an obvious way. The cost of that delay isn't always immediate. And that's what makes it so easy to overlook. By the time the urgency becomes clear, the opportunity to respond early has already passed. For David, Lauren, and Michael Carter, the reflection didn't come all at once. It unfolded slowly, shaped by conversations, by quiet moments of realization, by the gradual understanding that those small signs had always meant more than they believed. It wasn't about blame as much as it was about awareness, about recognizing how easily people adjust to change when it happens gradually, how instinct can be softened by routine and familiarity. Emily Carter's story leaves behind more than just answers. It leaves a question that extends far beyond one family, one home, one moment. It speaks to something many people experience, but rarely examine closely: the tendency to wait, to hope that what feels off will resolve itself, to trust that time will provide clarity without requiring action. And maybe that is where the real impact of this story lies, not just in what happened, but in what it reveals about how people respond to the quiet signals in their own lives. Because those signals don't always demand attention in obvious ways. Sometimes they appear gently, consistently, asking to be noticed without forcing themselves into focus. And the question that remains, long after everything has been explained, is one that doesn't come with an easy answer. How many signs do we ignore before it's too late? What do you think? If you had been in Emily Carter's place, or standing where David Carter stood that night, would you have recognized the warning sign for what it truly was? Or would it have felt like everything else in life that seems small enough to wait on, easy enough to explain, familiar enough to ignore? It's a difficult question, and one that doesn't always have an honest answer in the moment, because the truth is, most signs don't arrive clearly labeled. They come quietly wrapped in routine, shaped by the normal pace of daily life, just like they did for Emily. So take a moment and think about it carefully, not just as a story you've watched, but as something that could happen in any home, in any routine, to anyone who believes they still have time to figure things out later. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because sometimes the answers we're searching for aren't hidden at all. They're right there, waiting to be seen. Just like they were for Emily Carter.